My name is Sammy Jabara. I'm a board-certified reproductive endocrinology fertility doctor. I've assisted a lot of patients, most recently beautiful couple RJ and Javier, to help them have a family, complementing the most important thing that you're doing, which is what you're doing, because what you're doing is really all the work. Really happy to have you today, happy to see you, and hope that everything will go safely for you and for them. In-vitro fertilization, in Latin, vitrio or vitro means a glass or a dish. So in-vitro fertilization, it's the fertilization that's happening in a dish. So you have an egg and a sperm, and the sperm is either naturally or through an injection process introduced inside the egg. And then that embryo, now the egg is called an embryo because it's fertilized, it's going to grow over the next 5 days or more in culture, and it's going to divide to 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, all the way to what we call a blastocyst stage, which is the day 5 stage. The embryo can be either implanted or can be frozen, could be also be biopsied, so that you could have a pre-implantation genetic testing on that embryo to see if the chromosomes, 23 chromosomes, are normal or not, and of course be able to determine as well the sex of the baby or the health of the babies, like for example diseases like Down syndrome. So that's basically what in vitro fertilization is. It also comprises later on transferring that embryo into a woman that actually is carrying the pregnancy or a woman that desires a pregnancy. So it's either an intended parent or a gestational carrier, we call it. In their case, that was a perfect situation. It's not available for everyone. A lot of same-sex couples have to undergo either a sperm or an egg donor, depending on who they are, from anonymous or a friend, because it's not always available to have someone from your own family. Genetics are a very, very complicated thing, but the closer you are, like if it's a brother or sister, or if it's a cousin that will be a little further, will provide you with a very high percentage of your gene. And I can't quantify it to say if it's really 50%, but it's definitely a much higher amount of genes are going to be in match. You have more contribution from both sides on the genetic level. I believe that parenting is not a genetic process, and I believe that equalities happens, you know, when you take care of the baby, and the baby's really going to be attached to the parents that takes the primary caregiver. For example, if we have a healthy gestational carrier, we have a healthy egg and a healthy sperm, when we have that healthy situation, that's when we have the highest percentages, which would be higher than 75% chance of getting pregnant in one try. Yeah, a gestational carrier has to be a healthy person in general, number one, to not have any medical illnesses like diabetes, severe asthma, or any high blood pressure problems. Second, it would be preferable that the gestational carrier be someone who has experienced a pregnancy, preferably her own pregnancy, because there's always a risk whenever you're pregnant. It's a low risk, but it will always be more reassuring if somebody has had this before. So those are like the 2 major conditions. Of course, other parameters are, you know, the psychological well-being, the environment that she's living in. You know, there'll be no substance abuse, of course. So health of the uterus as well, that's determined separately from the health of the body. A uterus that didn't have 4 C-sections or didn't have major fibroids and or polyps, etc., etc.
So I am here at the Fertility Institute waiting for my doctor to come in to do a saline sonogram, which means they just basically testing the uterus or putting saline and betadine, I think, in there to make sure that my uterus is shaped okay, there's no blockages in my fallopian tubes and all these things.
So it's health of the person, health of the uterus, health of the mind. Most practitioners and most doctors would not like the surrogate to be above a certain age. For example, in my situation, would like to be the surrogate below the age of 45. Even when you stretch it that far, I mean, there are more chances that women in their 40s having more gestational hypertension and other problems. But in general, I mean, I think up to 45, most people would agree to that. So there's not a lot of preparation. The reason we actually oftentimes use hormones or use preparation, it's because of coordination. Oftentimes the carrier lives, as in your case, President Ocean, or in another state, so there's coordination involved. And also there's cost. Every time you do an ultrasound, every time you do a blood test, that adds to the cost of the intended parents. So in order to minimize all of that, in order to increase the accuracy of the process, because also there's a limited supply of embryos, we do not have the luxury to say, well, if it didn't work with this embryo, we'll just do it with this and do it with that. Sometimes we only have one embryo or two or three that are normal. So then we like to control the process, not allow the natural cycle to occur. So instead, we prepare by using estrogen, which are pills.
All right, you guys, this is it. It is official. I have officially started hormones. Regular birth control, but a double dose of it every day. This is just the beginning. Next comes all the other fun stuff, suppositories, patches, injections. Oh my.
Some people give it in a form of patch, and sometimes it is given vaginally. That's done for about 2 weeks, I would say. And then doing an ultrasound and making sure the thickness of the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. At that point, we start progesterone. Progesterone is given as a shot in addition to the vaginal. And that's for about 5 or 6 days before you do the transfer. The transfer, luckily, is really not a painful procedure. It's very much shorter in time as people think. The transfer is done through a pelvic exam where we put a speculum, very similar to a pap smear. We use a very thin and supple catheter that we introduce through the cervix under ultrasound guidance. We put in the embryo through that catheter. After that, you continue doing the progesterone that you already started 5 days ago, once a day as a shot, and you continue doing the vaginal inserts twice a day in our case. You continue taking estrogen, but to a lesser extent. So probably if you had a patch, you remove it, or if you were on a high dose of estrogen, you decrease it by 1. And you continue doing that. You continue taking the baby aspirin or prenatal vitamins. You just, at that point, mind your own business and do your own life. On the 9th day after the transfer, we will do a blood level called ACG, level on the blood that indicates if you're pregnant or not and how high is the level. At that point, we continue all the medications. Hopefully we have a good result. We continue all the medication, and then 2 days later, we'll repeat that level, hoping that it will increase by 66% or more. Most oftentimes it will double 2 days later. At that point, you'll be already 4 weeks when you did the first level, because it's 9 days after your transfer. Maybe at around 6.5 weeks, which would be 2.5 weeks after your first blood test, we do an ultrasound to determine if implantation has occurred and if there is a heartbeat. Most doctors would say that the shots will be stopped between 10 and 12 weeks of pregnancy. And most people would finish taking any form of hormone by the 12 to 13 weeks of pregnancy. from a physical perspective, everything is the same from there on. Oftentimes, people tell me it's for some reason easier than oral pregnancy because you've never experienced the first one and they know. So oftentimes easier. You don't become a high-risk patient. You do not. You do not become somebody who needs to be induced. You do not need to be somebody who has a C-section. You do not have increase of any of those risks if you are having one baby. Now, if you're having twins, just like a twin pregnancy, it will be more complicated and you would have to have a C-section or whatever is needed to be done. The range of IVF is very variable depending on what you do in IVF. If you only did an extraction, a fertilization, and a transfer without genetic testing, it probably costs $10,000 for IVF, $5,000 for the medication. If you are, and that's a very, very approximated cost, and it depends from state to state, from place to place. Most of the times you have to do genetic testing. That's another $5,000. We're talking about 15 plus 5 at the minimum level, because you also might do an embryo transfer, which might cost another $4,000 if the embryo was normal. So if you're doing a genetic and you need to freeze the embryo, which costs another $1,000 to $2,000. So you're talking about, in a regular IVF situation, a process costing about $25,000 when you include everything for one time. And if you're talking about a gestational carrier situation, it depends if you found a friend or found an agency. And if you're doing an egg donor, it's like an IVF plus to give compensation to the donor and other testing and other things, which will add significantly. And if you're doing a gestational carrier, you're adding a significant amount of also testing, psychologic, but also legal, infectious disease. Those are very costly. I would say those alone are about $15,000 or $20,000. If you've gone through an agency, the agency has their own cost. If it is a paid surrogacy or paid gestational carrier, there is a compensation that happens to the gestational carrier. And I cannot speak for that because that varies tremendously, but the lowest I've seen was $25,000 and the highest I've seen was $50,000 or $1,000 or $60,000. So it's a very variable process. And there's also a cost of insurance. Some insurances accept to cover, like if you have your own insurance as a gestational carrier, some insurers accept the fact that you are doing gestational care, some of them don't. Some do only if you are doing it for a friend. You might have to purchase your own insurance, have your own costs, in addition to life insurance and other things. So, yeah. The most important thing is to go over your plan A, your plan B, have a timeline, have a financial planning, know what your percentages or your success rates are. And so you're not like distraught whenever you get the result, whether hopefully it's a positive result, you won't be, but if it's negative. So have a long-term plan. For the gestational carrier themselves, I would say that they're courageous, they're doing a great act, a great altruistic thing, no matter whether they're compensated or not. I'm amazed about the sacrifice that gestational surrogates do for the parents, and we have to look at them as the light of our lives. And there's not enough money that can compensate for that. It's more like a relationship to have the utmost positivity and prayers and happiness and sending good energy for whoever is helping them to have their baby.
Oh, thank you, Jabara. This is a long time coming. That's fine. Let's just give them lots of positive energy.